Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. One of the most important things for preppers to keep in their home is food, and there's a lot of different ways that you can go about storing it. Freeze-dried meals are popular, but they're too expensive for many people to store in large quantities. Canned goods work well if you want something more economical, but probably the cheapest way to stockpile large quantities of food is to buy dry goods and package them yourself. Preppers have been doing this for quite a while now, but many times we tend to overlook some food items that could give us some more variety or add some additional nutrients to our diet. So today we're going to be taking a look at 20 different foods that you can store long-term in Mylar. This video is also part of the 30 Days of Preparedness, so after you've watched it, be sure to check out the rest of the videos in that playlist. And I'll be sure to link to that in the description below. Rice is one of the most common food items that people store in Mylar. And the reason for that is that it gives you a whole lot of bang for your buck. You can store a bunch of it for not a whole lot of money when compared to other food items. Now, given prices have gone up over the past year, but I'm still able to find 20-pound bags for around $11 or $12 where I live. Now, for long-term storage, white, jasmine, and basmati rice are going to be your best bets, and when stored in a Mylar bag with oxygen absorbers, those can last for 20 years or longer. Brown rice is better from a nutritional standpoint, but you're not going to get nearly as much storage time out of that because it has such a high oil content. You may only get around 5 years out of it before it starts to go rancid. The other big food that preppers like to stockpile in Mylar is beans. Pinto beans are the most common since they're the most widely available in bulk quantities, but other kinds of beans like black beans and lima beans are good to have as well since they'll add a little bit of variety to your diet. And having that variety is good for both your morale and your physical health. And when you eat beans and rice together, they do form a complete protein, and that's one reason why preppers tend to store both. And that's valuable because if a situation lasts long enough, you may not have access to your normal protein sources. Now, I will admit that I would be pretty depressed if I didn't have large quantities of beef and chicken to consume whenever I want to, but the bottom line is that rice and beans are better than starving, and like rice, beans, when stored properly, can last for 20 years or more. Lentils are similar to beans and can also be paired with rice to form a complete protein. One advantage that they have over beans, though, is that you don't have to soak them before you cook them, so that's going to make them a little bit faster and easier to prepare. Lentils are also a good source of iron and protein, and they're one of the easiest legumes to digest. But one disadvantage to them is that it's not going to be as easy to find them in large quantities, at least not at regular grocery stores. Another legume that preppers may want to stockpile is split peas, and unlike most other legumes, these do form a complete protein all by themselves, although they're a little low on one amino acid, methionine. Like with lentils, these are a little bit more difficult to find in large bulk quantities, but they're still worth having in your food preps. Storing wheat berries in Mylar is one of the best ways to have a long-term supply of grains. Like the other things on this list, these can last for 20 years or more if stored properly. And there's a couple of different ways that you can eat wheat berries. The easiest is to just soak them in water, but probably the most common way that wheat berries are used is to be ground into flour. But if you're going to do this, you will need a good quality manual grain mill. But the advantage to doing that is that wheat berries have a much longer shelf life when they are not ground up. So if you grind it as you need it, then you're going to be able to take advantage of that longer shelf life. And although flour does have a shorter shelf life than the other things on this list at around 5 years, you still may want to have some in your food storage. For example, if you don't have a good grain mill right now and you can't afford one, then just stockpiling some flour and rotating through it can be a good option. You could store gluten-free flour if you have somebody in your family with celiac disease or some other gluten sensitivity, and that might be a good idea even if you have a manual grain mill, because storing everything that you would need to make those different blends of gluten-free flour could be difficult. Dry pasta is another food that preppers can store if they have somebody in their family with gluten sensitivities. And this is one option that I really do like because you can get all sorts of different noodles for preparing different kinds of dishes, and both gluten-free and regular dry pasta can last for 20 years or more when stored in Mylar with an oxygen absorber. But you do want to be careful when storing certain types of pasta since they may have sharp edges which can damage the bags. So when you're storing pasta, be sure to use the thickest bags that you can and check on them from time to to time to make sure that they haven't been punctured. Another grain that you can stockpile for up to 20 years is quinoa. And this is one that a lot of preppers overlook just because they don't know about it, but it goes well in things like soups and salads, or you can serve it as a side dish just by itself or mix it with something like rice. Probably the biggest advantage to storing quinoa is that it has a ton of nutrients, including copper and magnesium, and it's also a good source of fiber and protein. But one downside to it though is that since it's not a regular part of some people's diet, if that's the case with you, go ahead and buy some and make sure you and your family will actually eat it before you store it in large quantities. Another good long-term survival food that some people overlook is rolled or instant oats. And having oats on hand is nice because most of us have eaten things like oatmeal. You can also use them to create homemade granola. You can mix them with honey, and then you can also use them to make other things like muffins or pancakes. But when stockpiling oats for long-term storage, be sure to pick up rolled or instant oats. These have a longer shelf life than other kinds of oats and can last for up to 30 years if they're packaged properly in a Mylar bag with oxygen absorber, and they are available in gluten-free varieties as well, although oats generally are gluten-free anyway. If you have somebody who's really sensitive, like they have hardcore celiac disease, then you probably want to err on the side of caution and get the gluten-free variety anyway. Another dry food that you can stockpile in Mylar is corn. Field corn works well for this, and it can store for up to 25 years. But this is another thing that if you're going to store it and you plan on grinding it into something like cornmeal, then you will need a very hefty grain mill, even more so than what you would need for wheat berries, because dried corn isn't all that easy to get through. And you can store other varieties of corn as well, like popcorn. But if you can't afford a grain mill, then you're going to want to store some cornmeal. This is most commonly used to make things like cornbread, but you can use it for other things like frying fish, and that would be particularly useful if you had a stock pond full of catfish. Life goals. Now, the main downside to storing cornmeal is that, like flour, it only lasts for around 5 or 10 years, even in a Mylar bag, and it can be more prone to botulism than other dry foods. And the main reason for that is that cornmeal tends to have a slightly higher moisture content than a lot of other dry goods, so keep an eye on your bags. If they start to bulge or get puffy, you want to throw those out right away, because botulism is not something that you want to mess with. And having it would be even worse during a disaster situation, since you wouldn't have access to modern medicine. Corn masa or masa harina is similar to cornmeal, but it'll allow you to do one of the most important things imaginable during a survival situation. And that is either make tortillas for tacos or make other Mexican dishes like tamales. Now, there is some debate as far as how long this stuff will last, so I would recommend using it within 3 to 5 years on a rotating basis. And like with cornmeal, keep an eye on your bags, make sure they aren't showing any signs of botulism. And for masa harina or any other dry food, if you open the bag and it smells rancid, just get rid of it. One of my favorite comfort foods that you can stockpile in Mylar is instant potatoes. I dearly love mashed potatoes, and having some potato flakes set aside is just a good way to make sure that I have a reliable supply. You can also use instant potatoes for soups or as a breading for different kinds of meat. And how things like potatoes, rice, and beans will taste will largely depend on the spices that you use while you're preparing them. Having a good variety of different spices and seasonings can go a long way towards giving you some much needed variety in your diet. When you store those in Mylar bags, most spices will last between 2 and 10 years, and you can usually put the jar and everything directly into the bag. Just be aware that a lot of seasonings out there, like Tony's Cajun seasoning, are very high in salt. So you don't want to add an oxygen absorber to those, because if you do, it's all going to clump up and turn hard, and you'll have something like a food brick, and you don't want that. And another thing to keep in mind with spices is that they don't really expire in a make you sick sense, but they will start to lose their flavor and effectiveness over time. The next food item that you should stockpile is salt, and this is one food item that'll last forever. And when it comes to storing salt, you have a lot of different options. Most preppers will want to have at least some iodized salt in their preps to ensure that they get the iodine that they need in their diet. But when storing iodized salt, you need to understand that the iodine will lose its effectiveness after around 5 years or so. And if that happens, then the salt is still going to be perfectly safe to consume, even if it has kind of a slightly yellow tinge to it, but you won't have the added benefit of that iodine. And like I said a second ago, do not add oxygen absorbers to bags of salt. Nothing biological is going to survive in just a bag full of salt anyway, and you'll have the food brick problem I mentioned a second ago. Another food item that'll last forever is sugar, and although you shouldn't load your food down with it, it does have its place. It can add needed calories to your diet and also just help your food taste better, but it's also a valuable barter item because it's pretty cheap to store in large quantities now, but people will be desperate for it during a long-term disaster. But when storing it, like with salt, don't add an oxygen absorber because food brick. Sport drink mixes are another thing that you can store in Mylar. These can help you replace electrolytes, and that powder is going to last a whole lot longer than something like a pre-made bottle of liquid Pedialyte. And I know that there are better options out there than Gatorade because that has such a high sugar content, but one positive side effect of that sugar content is that you can store it pretty much exactly the way that you would sugar. Just put it in a Mylar bag, no oxygen absorber, and it should last a very long time. Another drink that you can store in Mylar bags is instant coffee. Most instant coffee is freeze-dried, so when you store it in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, it should last for up to 20 years or more. Even though a lot of people may turn up their nose at the idea of drinking instant coffee now, during a long-term disaster, it may be your best bet if you want to have that. Coffee only grows well in certain parts of the world, so just adding it to your garden isn't really going to be doable for most people. If you store green coffee beans in Mylar, you may be able to get a few years of storage out of them, but the roasted and pre-ground stuff that you buy at the store isn't going to last nearly as long. But if you store instant coffee, you'll have something that's easy to prepare, can be broken down into smaller containers, and also works well as a barter item. Powdered milk is another food item that you can store in Mylar bags, and even if you don't plan on drinking it outright, it can be used to make other things, like mashed potatoes, oatmeal, or muffins. If stored properly, dry milk can last somewhere between 15 and 20 years. One interesting item that many preppers don't think to stockpile is Jell-O powder. To store it, just take the bag out of its box and place it in a Mylar bag. Poking a small hole in the Jell-O's paper packaging bag can help you squeeze some of that air out, but like with sugar, don't add an oxygen absorber to it. You can use this during colder months to make gelatin desserts, or you can do that year-round if you have a 12-volt refrigerator and a solar generator. And then there's some other food-related items that you can store in Mylar, including things like baking soda, baking powder, and even heirloom seeds. Now, when it comes to actually storing your food in Mylar bags, start by pouring your food into them. And as you go along, you may want to shake the bags to allow the food to settle as much as possible, just because that's going to reduce the amount of dead airspace in the bag and make your oxygen absorber's life a little bit easier. Try to fill the bags as much as you can, leaving just enough room at the top of the bag to close it and seal it. Next, add oxygen absorbers to your bags, and when I'm doing this, I try to have as many bags ready to go as I can before I open those up, just because I don't want those exposed to the open air any longer than they need to be. If you have bags with zippers at the top, try to close those as much as possible before you add oxygen absorbers. That'll just further limit the amount of time that they spend in the open air. After that, squeeze as much air as you can out of the bag and then heat seal the top. And when it comes to heat sealing, there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. First, you could use a dedicated heat sealer. This is probably the easiest and the fastest way to do it, or if you don't want to buy a dedicated sealer, you could always just use a hair straightener, and that does have some advantages on its own. For one, you can seal the bags most of the way and just leave a small gap for the oxygen absorber like what you would with bags with zippers. Hair straighteners also work much better for larger bags like those you would use with 5-gallon buckets. Just be aware that if you use a hair straightener to seal Mylar, it might smell like plastic afterwards, which is something my wife still isn't really all that thrilled about. And it's important to understand that food storage is just one thing that you would need during a long-term disaster. If you want to see some other things that you would need in that kind of situation, then check out this video. Or if you want to see a more in-depth look at how I package my food in Mylar, then check out this video. You can also use the link in the description below to check out the other videos in the 30 Days of Preparedness playlist. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.